We have a terrific show for you this evening, and the pressure is mounting on the FBI to explain how it failed to prevent last week's Florida school massacre. And President Trump lays into former President Obama for failing to stop Russian election meddling. Plus, political hackery meets presidential history. So-called experts in the New York Times say Trump isn't just bad, he's the worst president ever. But first, the fallout from the shooting at a Parkland, Florida high school on Wednesday that killed 17 people is turning into a student-led mass movement against guns. And now President Trump is signaling he may favor gun control legislation. Students are involved in the planning at least in 4 major upcoming protests, including a march on Washington next month. Parkland, Florida students who survived last week's shooting are taking to the airwaves to promote the new campaign.
The tragedy at Stoneman Douglas was not because of Stoneman Douglas. It was because people like Nicholas Cruz were able to buy these weapons. We're not going to let the 17 bullets we just took take us down. If anything, we're going to keep running, and we're going to lead the rest of the nation behind us.
Meanwhile, President Trump reportedly was moved by the sight of Parkland victims during a visit to the hospital on Friday and discussed gun control options with friends over the weekend. This morning, the White House announced the president supports legislation to strengthen the federal background check system. While the measure is relatively modest and not yet opposed by the NRA, it could be a sign of more ambitious gun control efforts to come. Let's discuss this with former House Oversight Committee Chairman Jason Chaffetz and Democratic strategist Antoine Seawright. Jason, Congressman, you were in Congress for a long time, not too long, but long enough. What can you do, if anything, to make sure this doesn't happen again?
Well, I wish there was one thing we could do to make sure that it never, ever happens again. But I do like this idea of fixing the National Instant Background System. If you go to the website fixnics.org, you'll see that the Shooting Sports Foundation and others support this. I supported it when I was in Congress. It's passed out of the House, I believe, and it has bipartisan support. In the Senate. It makes sense. There are some people who can't distinguish between right and wrong, and they shouldn't be able to acquire a gun. I have a gun. I have 5 guns. I have a concealed carry permit. I am a member of the NRA. But people who can't make these types of decisions shouldn't be able to access a gun. And when this guy gets kicked out of school, obviously has problems, the police come to his house 30 times, there's a problem in him accessing a gun. And just to give the viewers and the audience a little more context on what you're discussing with the Fix NICS program, currently it is not required by federal law that states input mental health records into the background check system. And mentally adjudicated or committed individuals cannot, at this point, buy or purchase a gun. It's prohibited. There's a question about it on the background check form when you purchase a gun. This legislation required that states do that, so there's not that gap in the system. But Antoine, you have a different take. You're going after the firearms rather than necessarily states inputting these mental health records. Why do you think we're in this position? And is blaming the NRA and accusing them of being on the side of murderers really forwarding this conversation?
Well, let me tell you where I am. I am on the side of common sense gun reform measures being implemented in this country. I have zero confidence in Washington, D.C., dysfunctional city to get this done. I think we have to lean heavily on local legislative bodies and even local governments, like here in Columbia, South Carolina, where I'm from, where the mayor and the city council in a very unified way ban the selling of bump stocks. But here's what I think. Keep in mind, it was this president who signed an executive order to reverse a decision that implemented by the Obama administration to take guns out of the hands of those who have mental illness issues.
I'm really glad you brought that up, because that's actually not true. What President Trump did was rescind an executive order by President Obama that said that Social Security recipients and veterans who wanted someone to help them with their finances were then deemed mentally unfit and therefore unable to pass a background check, and their Second Amendment rights were taken away with due process. So to say that he took something back that now enables mentally ill people to get a gun just isn't true. Jason, I want to go back to you. I want to go back to you real quickly. We've heard a whole lot about. We heard a whole lot about new gun control measures and people saying that this is an issue of making sure we take certain kinds of firearms off of the streets. There's also the other side of the argument that we haven't heard as much about. There are students in that school who don't like being sitting ducks. There are a number of teachers who are members of the NRA. There are a number of NRA members who have children who go to these schools who believe that they are soft targets and that things need to be changed. What do you say about school districts around the country who have decided to allow teachers to be armed inside of their classrooms?
No, look, you got some teachers that can't negotiate a Bunsen burner, so it's not for everybody. But I think these are soft targets. You got to be able to make sure that individuals can't get into that school in the first place. One of the reports we heard out of Florida is they had some bulletproof glass or some hardened glass, so he couldn't actually shoot out the window and shoot at students that were fleeing. But you're going to have a resource officer. Maybe it's a police officer who's on duty or off duty who knows how to wield a gun. And I do believe that certain teachers in certain places should and can be equipped. They do it in Colorado. They do it in other places. And I think it's a good idea for a lot of places. Mm-hmm. And by the way, Baltimore, Chicago, and Washington, D.C. have some of the most stringent rules and laws. Yeah, well, that's true. Yeah. And they have some of the biggest problems with guns.
Anton, you want to respond to that? Is that an irrelevant point? Is that not a relevant point to bring up? And the fact that Chicago's had hundreds of murders in 2017, and yet it's not in the headlines every day?
It's the go-to Republican pivot talking point.
Is it not
true?
Let me
tell you what I think.
Is it not true?
But it's true. It's true, isn't it?
It's the go-to Republican pivot talking point.
Is it true or not?
Let me tell you
True
what
or
I think.
false?
But is it true?
Let me tell you what reasonable people want. They want to not have AK-47s on the street. A 19-year-old who can't rent a car or buy wine should never be able to purchase an AK-47. Reasonable people want to close the Charleston loophole. So for instance, my friend Clemente Pinckney, who was killed in a church here in Charleston, South Carolina, so that will not happen again. Reasonable people want to ban bump stocks. The reasonable things that people want to do instead of the traditional pivot to talk about Baltimore and Chicago the red meat talking points.
You talk about being reasonable. Is it unreasonable to think that places like Chicago and Baltimore that have all of the gun control legislation you could possibly ask for would not be the examples that we should follow considering their murder rates?
Sure, but here's what I would tell you. I'm not saying gun control is the all-out, be-out final answer, but I think it will be part of the solution to the problem in this country to prevent another Charleston, to prevent another Newtown, to prevent another Parkland, Florida.
All right, we've seen that hasn't worked, but Jason, last word to you.
No, hey, look, I would get rid of bump stocks as well, but there is a lot of education that needs to go on. But I own guns. I have a constitutional right to own guns, but there's got to be a way to find people who are mentally unfit to be able to. They shouldn't be able to purchase them, and if they run into trouble, then they should take those guns away. This kid should have never had it, and they got to tie all those loops together.
Right. Well, Jason, Anton,
thank you. Jason, you would agree that we do not need AK-47s on the street, right?
I think that's an overstatement of the situation, but thank you to you both for coming on the show tonight.
I do not
appreciate
agree with
it. Thank you. CBS is reporting the Florida Department of Children and Families investigated Nicholas Cruz in 2016 and found he suffered from depression, ADHD, and autism, and had even warned he planned to buy a gun. But the agency reportedly closed the investigation after finding no evidence he was being mistreated. Meanwhile, Friday's apology from the FBI isn't good enough for Florida Governor Rick Scott. He is now demanding the Bureau release all details on why it ignored 2 warnings about Cruz. Let's talk about that with retired FBI Special Agent Don Iannarelli. Thank you so much tonight for coming on the show, sir. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
So the big question here is, how does the FBI keep missing these issues? We mentioned in the previous segment the Charleston church massacre. That was also an FBI loophole that was missed. How is it that this keeps happening? And in terms of the protocols that they talk about that weren't followed, can you give us some insight on what those things might mean?
Certainly. Well, first of all, it's tragic. It's inexcusable, and it's a terrible thing to have occurred. To draw the distinction, in the Charleston case, there was information that was not reported to the FBI. Hence, the FBI did not have it available to go back to the gun store and deny a permit. In this case, something broke down at the call center, whether it's a technical issue or someone dropped the ball. But Director Wray has come out very publicly, not only in apologizing, but recognizing we need to figure out what went wrong so it never happens again.
Yeah, I just want to walk through the timeline again so the viewers understand the tips and when they came in. The first tip came on September 24th, 2017. The FBI responded by saying there was enough information. The person they were discussing wasn't identifiable, so they couldn't follow up on that lead. The second one came in on January 5th, where the man was identified. He said he had a desire to kill people, erratic behavior was reported, and his social media reports. And specifically, he said he wanted to conduct a school shooting. Now, this is the second tip that the FBI is admitting that the protocol was not followed through. So I think people really have a question about, it's one thing to miss the first one if there's not enough information, but how is it when someone specifically reports to the FBI that someone has said they want to be a professional school shooter, how that person is not at least paid a visit by the Bureau?
You're absolutely right, and that's the reason it needs to be looked at to see why. But let's remember, too, agents would have received this lead in Miami if it had been passed to them. They would have gone out and talked to this individual. Up until the time he actually fired shots, no crime had been committed. The best the FBI agents could have done was to speak with him. But it's his First Amendment rights to say things until he makes a very specific threat that is actionable and you can take him into custody.
Can you detail how specific the threat needs to be, though? Because when he is reported as saying, I want to be a professional school shooter, they know that he was expelled from a specific high school, that the police had gone to his home 36 times. That seems pretty specific. So how specific does it have to get before the FBI can do something?
Whether law enforcement on the local or federal level, the threat has to be something to the effect of, I want to go to school on this day and kill somebody, or I'm planning to do it on this day. I want to kill this specific person. The general statements of, I want to be a school shooter, believe it or not, is your First Amendment right. Now, if the laws are wrong, let the Congress, the legislature get in there and change those laws, giving law enforcement more power. But until they do, agents are hamstrung to do nothing more than knock on the door. And if he says, I don't want to talk to you, they have to leave.
But do you believe that a knock on the door may have at least been some kind of deterrent? It seems like this kid didn't think anyone was paying attention to him. He was very brazen about the things that he was saying on social media. Do those FBI house calls actually make a difference when it comes to deterring those kinds of crimes?
Knock and talks, as they're called in law enforcement, are done by all police agencies, and including the FBI. I've done hundreds of them in my careers, and agents do them every day across the country. Sometimes those people I spoke with went ahead and committed the crime anyway. Sometimes they didn't. We'll never know, but it's important that that mistake doesn't happen again. And Director Wray is assured he's going to find out why it happened and fix the problem.
Yeah, and just on one final note, Governor Rick Scott has called for Director Wray to resign. Many have said that's a bit of a step too far, but he also said, quote, people in Washington tend to want to investigate, hold hearings, and put off what truly needs to be done. Instead, someone needs to be held accountable. Do you think any kind of accountability is going to come out of this mistake?
Absolutely. There was a lapse somewhere. Whether it was a technical lapse, whoever maintains the system, that's an issue, or if it's a physical lapse in an actual person. But that's the whole point. The FBI is not interested in having hearings. They're interested in action. Fix that problem so that it doesn't ever happen again.
Okay. John Iannivelli, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
It may not be surprising that President Trump is blaming President Obama for not stopping Russian campaign meddling, but this is a surprise. One of the top Democrats investigating Trump actually agrees. Corey Lewandowski joins us to figure out what happens next.
Today, big thinking in the Finger Lakes is pushing the new New York forward. We're the #1 dairy and apple producer.
Obama was president up to and beyond the 2016 election. So why didn't he do something about Russian meddling? Top House Intelligence Democrat Adam Schiff actually agreed, acknowledging the Obama administration should have done more when it learned of Russian meddling in 2014. But Schiff disagreed with Trump's assertion that the indictments clear him of collusion with Russians. Rush Limbaugh says there was collusion, but not by Trump.
This is all politics, and it's, Chris, it hasn't changed from the get-go. It is about protecting Hillary and Obama. Obama is the primary person being protected because all of this spying and all of this collusion to destroy Trump happened with his knowledge and probably encouragement.
All right.
And the reason Hillary isn't charged is because that would mean Obama would have to be exposed as participating.
All right, well, let's debate that with former Trump campaign manager Corey Lewandowski and attorney Scott Bolden. We'll start with the point of agreement. Adam Schiff agreeing with President Trump that Obama should have done more. Corey, your thoughts on that?
I never thought I'd say it. I agree with Adam Schiff. He's correct.
And any expansion on what the president should have done, meaning President Obama, in terms of knowing about this in 2014?
Well, look, what we've seen from this recent indictment is that the government was aware in 2014, 16 months before Donald Trump ever got into the race, and the CIA director, the director of national intelligence, the president of the United States, and the former head of the FBI seem to have done nothing about it. And so there should be accountability on their part, because anybody who messed with the U.S. election system should be held accountable. And that administration did nothing, it seems like, to stop the Russians potentially meddling in our election system.
Now, Scott,
well, we certainly don't know what they did.
Sure, but let's go back to the basics here of why the special counsel was appointed in the first place. The initial goal was to look and investigate at whether the Trump campaign colluded with the Russians to sway an election. So far, despite the 13 indictments we saw last week and the previous indictments of Paul Manafort and his business partner, we have seen no evidence of that collusion. So where do we go now with this narrative that Democrats and the media have pushed to tear the country apart over the past year on this Russian narrative?
Well, first of all, the special counsel, let me correct your premise, was to investigate Russians meddling in the election. One part of it was possible collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia, because the failure to disclose and the other lies that were being told by those who were on the Trump campaign was problematic. And then you had the conflict, and now you got the special prosecutor. Secondly, the Republicans are the ones who are investigating Donald Trump and Russian meddling. They control the House, the Senate, and the White House. The head of the agencies, the head of DOJ, the FBI, who Donald Trump is highly critical of, are all pushing this investigation, and they are all Republicans. And so it's incontrovertible, as Mick Baxter says, that the Russians meddled in this election. And as we continue to get through prosecutions and investigations, we're going to find out what, if anything, Donald Trump or the people around him or in that campaign did to collude,
if ever.
or if,
I mean,
if not obstruct justice.
We're a year into this, and we haven't found any of that yet. So I'm just wondering where. Sure, but I'm just wondering where the evidence is.
Doesn't mean the investigation is over.
I'm just wondering. Where is the evidence on this collusion issue? Look, Corey, you were there on the ground. You say it was not something that was happening. The evidence doesn't bear out that it was happening. Can't we just move on with the business of the country?
It's very clear. I was there before Donald Trump ever came down that escalator. We never colluded with Russians. There was one campaign, and only one campaign, that has admitted to taking $5 million of their campaign money, going and hiring a British spy to go and put a false dossier together, and it's the Clinton campaign. Right. So there should be an investigation into Russia collusion, and it's the Clinton campaign and the Podesta team who took $5 million of campaign money and went out and put together a false dossier, which we now know was used to put together a Pfizer warrant to spy on an American citizen on U.S. soil. So there was collusion by the Clinton campaign. It's unequivocal.
Oh, but it is true. Why is it not true?
That is just not true.
Which part is not true?
I'll tell you exactly right.
One at a time.
Well, no, if they spent $5 million, I don't know what they spent, but they certainly
we know what they spent.
Money. Hold on, let me finish. They spent money on the dossier for sure. That was turned over to the Department of Justice, and here's where the GOP and Corey and others want to jump into conjecture, and that is that it was the basis of this Pfizer warrant. They lied to the judge, and therefore that's why we've got this investigation. That is completely false. You're jumping from one.
Well, look, I don't want to tread over. I want to tread over old ground.
I want the Pfizer warrant or not.
I don't want to tread over old ground. I want to focus on this new indictment that came out last week on the 13
simple.
Russians moving
You're guessing,
forward.
Corey.
Go ahead,
and the
Corey.
rest of the GOP is.
Look, it's very simple. The Clinton campaign has admitted to going out to Russia and trying to dig up dirt on Donald Trump. They're the only campaign that took $5 million of campaign money and did this. The Trump campaign never spent a dime doing that. We never colluded with anybody. We never coordinated with anybody. We never contacted anybody. The Clinton campaign can't say the same thing. Those are the facts. And what we know is the document that they put together was, if not the basis for, at least part of the application for the Pfizer warrant, and that is illegal.
So let's go back to this. I just want to hold on. Hold on. I want to go back to this indictment that came out on Friday of the 13 Russians and the 3 companies and what that actually means. If you look at the effectiveness of this, Democrats have been focusing for a very long time on the fact that Russians were pushing out this propaganda and that possibly it would have changed an election. It would have changed votes. It would have changed people's minds in terms of what they were doing. But I want to point to this Weekly Standard a piece that was out today, and they point out that a Trump rally regularly attracted 15,000 Floridians, whereas a fake Russian-organized Trump rally attracted only 15. And I also want to play this soundbite and this coverage from mainstream media outlets covering these fake rallies that were put on by Russians.
Right now, this is lots of different groups of people who have come together with no necessarily official leader, and that's been some of the criticism.
It's just the size, and he says it's amazing what the collective voices can spread in this protest.
Now, Corey, the interesting thing about that rally is it actually happened after the election. And if you look at what Facebook was doing in the ads that were purchased by the Russians, the majority of them were purchased after the election, which goes to show really they were interested in tearing the country apart rather than promoting one or the other of a candidate. Final word.
Well, and look, the Russian ads were about $46,000. They were disproportionately targeted to the District of Columbia, which is 95% Democrat, and the state of Maryland, which is not exactly a competitive state. So either they were completely incompetent or they were working with the Clinton campaign to turn out her own voters in the District of Columbia and Maryland. So I'm not sure which one it was, but it's probably one of those two.
All right. Well, thank you both. We're out of time for the segment, but thank you, Scott and Corey. We appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, Congress has put Dreamers into a legislative limbo after 4 immigration bills failed. But the administration doubles down on its vow to build the wall no matter what. We'll analyze the prospects up next.
People that we're going to build a wall. That means we're going to have a physical barrier. Once that funding is provided, we'll make the decisions. And I guarantee you this builder turned president will get that wall built faster than you could possibly imagine.
That comment, which aired on Fox and Friends this morning, was made during Pence's survey of the border with DHS Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen and Ted Cruz on Friday. Today, Speaker Paul Ryan indicated the House won't look at immigration legislation until next month. DACA protections expire on March 5th, but Ryan seems in no hurry after the Senate rejected 4 immigration plans last week. Let's discuss where we go from here with conservative political analyst Carrie Sheffield and Democratic strategist Robin Bureau. Carrie, lay out where we are. 4 bills down. How many to go?
Well, I mean, who knows the number? But, I mean, basically what we have right now is an obstructionist Congress. We have shutdown Schumer, who is more interested in putting the interest of foreigners ahead of the American sovereign people, ahead of people, the forgotten men and women of this country who put this president in the White House. It doesn't matter if you didn't vote for President Trump. The reality is the reason he won the White House is because of immigration. That was his signature issue. And so if Democrats want to continue to play obstructionist by blocking bill after bill after bill, they will reap what they sow come 2018 this November.
So, Robin, we've been through this before. My question for Democrats at this point is the president put a pretty generous offer on the table with 1.8 million DACA recipients or those who would qualify for DACA, not only to be able to gain legal status, but also to become citizens in return for the wall, which, by the way, Chuck Schumer voted for in 2006, the end of the visa lottery program, and the end to chain migration. Why is that not a fair trade? And now here we are down to the wire, and the Dreamers are in the middle.
Well, you know, it's interesting because you've got 2 different stories. But I paid careful attention to what Chuck Schumer said on the floor of the Senate the day after the shutdown. And he told us that he had a meeting with President Trump. And he proposed a budget that included the wall and with the dollar figure that Donald Trump himself gave him. And Donald Trump shut it out, and he shut that down and didn't do that. So that my point here is that we are willing to give him the wall. We just want to make sure that the taxpayers' money is being spent wisely and that we're good stewards of that money.
But what about the end to the visa lottery program, which we've seen has emboldened terrorists who have committed terrorist acts in the United States? Why that can't be part of the process? Why Democrats aren't into that? Can you explain?
You know, I wish I knew. I don't. I think that should be a part of the process. We've got work to do.
You are far too reasonable, Robin.
Carrie.
Well, and what about chain migration? I mean, that's the other issue here, too. Like, Why should the taxpayers, why should American taxpayers, the middle-class families, the forgotten men and women of this country be subsidizing? You know, the National Academy of Sciences found that 58% of immigrants who have children are taking welfare. Why should middle Americans be forced to subsidize foreigners who feel entitled for us to pay their tax money? Now, Robin, I'm sure you lock your doors at night. I'm sure you do. And it's not because you're a cisgendered, heteronormative, patriarchal, white supremacist racist.
Right.
I mean, like until the left learns to stop using this hateful rhetoric that dehumanizes people who have legitimate economic concerns, you're going to keep losing.
But Robin, on the point of the DACA recipients, they're not just mad at Republicans. In fact, they have put their fire towards people like Nancy Pelosi when she got surrounded at that town hall last year in San Francisco by people demanding that they do something. They're pretty angry that the Obama administration didn't do this when they were in the majority. So what about the electoral prospects for Democrats when it comes to this issue, considering there have been offers on the table from Republicans to give amnesty to these recipients, but from a Republican president and a Republican House?
Yes, I understand. But I want to point out, like I said, this comes to fiscal conservancy, and I know that sounds crazy coming from a Democrat.
Yes,
but the CBO has already issued a statement saying that for the cost of maintaining this border wall, we could replace the entire thing every 7 years. What we are alleging is that this is from a cost-benefit analysis, not the smartest way to secure our borders. It should be done with technology, with drones, with sensory devices, with increased personnel. I know this was a signature piece. I know that we're going to have to concede on it, but they want
$30 billion, which includes the wall and all of the things that you just discussed. But we're going to switch gears here. We're going to switch gears here to politics on a different note.
Okay.
We have our Utah resident, or former Utah resident, here in studio. Mitt Romney is running for the Senate.
Yes,
Donald Trump, President Donald Trump, has officially endorsed him tonight on Twitter. What do you have to say about that?
Well, I think, thank goodness, I love to see the Civil War ending because I love Mitt Romney. I used to work for Edward Conard, who was a former partner of Bain Capital with Mitt Romney, a major donor for him when Mitt ran. So I'm totally in the bag for him. I love Mitt, and I am so glad to see the Civil War, knock on wood, ending. And I was glad to see that, you know, Mitt responded to the president's tweet. And I have to say, I think that this was part of the condition to see Orrin Hatch retiring, that he would say, okay, look, let's just call a truce here to say, you know, okay, there might be some legitimate policy disagreements here, but let's stop with the name calling on all fronts here. And I think that's the problem.
Speaking of name calling, Robin, Democrats are already attacking Mitt Romney. Despite him being more of a middle-of-the-road moderate. In fact, some would say liberal on the issues of health care. Why is that?
Oh, God, that's a tough one. And I just hate, you know, I want to say this. I really want to say that I just hate how partisan the politics are becoming right now. I really don't like this us versus them. Mitt is a good candidate, and I'm glad to see that they were able to set aside their political differences. And I just wish that we could have more of that. Just what's
Robin,
good for the people.
Robin, then why don't you talk to the Democratic National Committee or the DSCC, which put out a press release going at the throat of Mitt Romney?
I applaud you. I think we'll end on the positive note of you both saying you're happy to see the Civil War end. Robin's happy to see that us versus them end. So we'll end on that note of unity and happiness. So moving along, thank you both for being here. Appreciate it. The economy is roaring back to life. ISIS is militarily defeated in Syria, and the Trump administration is just getting started. So guess where a New York Times poll of so-called experts ranks Trump among all presidents? Up next, we'll explore their alternative universe. Stick around. You'll love this or hate it. The New York Times apparently wants you to know that Donald Trump is the worst president ever, as if they haven't tried to make that clear already. Even though he's only been in office for 13 months, the Times surveyed what it called presidential political experts, 170 members of something called the American Political Science Association, aka college professors. And they ranked Trump dead last. Let's ask a presidential historian just what's going on here. Doug Weed is also a New York Times bestselling author whose latest work is Game of Thorns, the inside story of Hillary Clinton's failed campaign and Donald Trump's winning strategy. Doug, thank you so much for being here tonight. We appreciate
Thanks,
it.
Katie.
So we're 13 months in to the presidency of President Donald Trump. is it too soon to be saying he is the worst ever, considering the history of this country?
Yes, it is. Those professors would flunk one of their students if they tried a stunt like this. You can't make a judgment on the first year, and if you did, this is one of the most impactful presidents since FDR. I mean, JFK's first year was a disaster. He changed on the Bay of Pigs, and it turned out poorly. He did a poor job of preparation for Vienna. Nikita Khrushchev misunderstood it. He showed weakness that led to a nuclear confrontation. Reagan is one of America's greatest presidents. His first year, he was shot, and the only thing he got passed was price supports. He got a tax deduction, but the big tax reform, that came 5 years later. So Donald Trump, what he's done in 1 year, wiped ISIS off the maps of the Middle East, turned this economy around. It's shooting off like a rocket. It's a remarkable first year.
Yeah, well, this actually reminds me, remember when President Obama was given the Nobel Peace Prize before he even came into office? This is like that, but in the complete reverse. Can you give us some more context, though, on how presidents are judged, not in the time necessarily that they are in office broadly, but historically how things change, the context of our times, the results of the actions that they take in office, and their long-term implications?
Yeah, well, first of all, I have to tell you that they have some refined metrics on judging these presidents. They